Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to discuss with you one of the more interesting aspects of how our body responds extremely quickly to potentially dangerous situations and stimuli. And so you're probably most familiar with this because we've experienced this multiple times in our life, but I thought it might be fun to sort of kick around sort of the neurology behind spinal cord reflexes. That's right. These are automatic responses that are coordinated just within the spinal cord. Can you imagine this? So, in other words, something happens and we respond to it, and the brain isn't necessarily controlling it. And so I hope that's intriguing to you. Um, one of the things our body sometimes gets involved into dangerous situations. We might be touching something by accident. Uh, this looks a little intentional, but if you were to prick yourself on a pin, or if you were to pick up something hot from the stove, for example, there isn't enough time in order for the body to say, when you're grabbing something really hot, it's like, oh, gee, this is really warm. Perhaps I should send a nerve impulse down to my hand and move my arm away. It needs to be fast. It needs to be a quick sort of automatic response that's triggered by some sort of detrimental stimulus. So I put specific stimuli, but it's often troublesome. And so um, it's controlled by the spinal cord alone and not the brain. Okay. And so let's get into that. So, for example, your skin has a variety of sensory neurons, and most of those, truthfully, this isn't about that, but it's truthfully, most of those are in the dermis. But there are some uh, nerve endings that can detect pain that are found pretty high or superficially, even within the epidermis of the skin, and it begins with these neurological sensory receptors, and they detect, like for this instance, pain. Okay, and the end result of this, what we refer to as a reflex arc, and that'll be made clear hopefully in a moment, ends with a peripheral, in other words, for the outside effector. In other words, a muscle is going to contract, generally opposing the original stimulus. In other words, moving away from trouble. So, you know, the the come away message is that our body's going to do anything it can to maintain homeostasis, and so if it incurs tremendous heat or cold or pain, it's going to try to respond and move away from said negative stimulus. And so the steps in a reflex arch or arc, a uh, neurological reflex or neural reflex is the arrival of the stimulus. And so in this instance, a prick. And so you're detecting it by pain receptors in your skin. It could be physical, could be chemical, could be, for example, the burning from an acid or a base or something like that. Um, and so the arrival of the stimulus, and then that activates the sensory neuron. And so this triggers a movement toward the central nervous system. So this is traveling, and as you can see here where the cursor is, this is an activation of a unipolar sensory neuron, which is part of our afferent nervous system. So it's moving toward the spinal cord. And as you can see, a cluster, it just shows one, but a cluster of sensory neurons, in particular the soma, accumulate in this region just adjacent to the spinal cord and what's known as the dorsal root ganglia. So this protuberance right in this area, and this is the root that's entering into the posterior region of the spinal cord. And you can see how the sensory neuron comes right into the gray matter, right in here. Okay, so it's step two is activation of a sensory neuron. Then number three is processing. So inside the gray matter of the spinal cord, the information is being processed. Okay, so in other words, those the soma, if you will, is then interpreting that, and it's triggered by a neurotransmitter, and so neurotransmitter is going to be released and that's going to be connecting to an afferent, in other words, exiting neuron, and happens to be a multipolar neuron, which is a motor neuron, and that's coming out here ventrally, or anterior or ventral root. It's passing out, and it's extending all the way down to an effector, which happens to be a muscle cell. And so the activation of the motor neuron is part of the efferent nervous system, and that's creating an action potential, and it's moving down the axon. And here at the neuromuscular junction, neurotransmitter is again released, and it's going to cause sarcomeres to shorten, and the muscle's going to contract, and that's going to produce an effect which then moves the hand away from or negatively away from the stimulus that was causing trouble in the first place. And so this is the response. Step 5 is the movement away from the tack. Okay, so it's referred to as a reflex arc because it sort of arcs around like that. It's sort of a connection between the afferent and efferent, and it's sort of going right through the spinal cord. Now, truth be told, that also nerve impulses, slightly delayed though, will relay information up to the brain ultimately in order to process the fact that the pain was being felt. Okay, so one of the things that I want to emphasize at the beginning of this conversation is that it's very quick. And so quickness is important sometimes. I know it's important to be thoughtful in your actions, but quick is also useful. So there's no integration with the brain. It doesn't reach the brain before the response occurs. So the response is sort of automatic, if you will. It is automatic. So the stimulus out, and your hand just quickly moves away from that. So it's a cool evolutionary response. There's few neurons involved. The synapses that are involved in the arc are shorter distance for the signal to travel, thus therefore faster, and it's involuntary, and no conscious control or no processing by the brain is necessary. So again, the signal direction comes in here. The dorsal root ganglia comes in through the gray matter. It triggers an efferent motor neuron to then move to the muscle and cause the muscle to contract. So pretty awesome. So for the remainder of this discussion, that's the basic idea of a reflex arc. But I wanted to kick around some classifications that physicians use in order to categorize reflexes. And so they could be considered developmentally, the types of responses in the reflex, the complexity of the circuit, and the process site in general. And so I want to begin with developmental. And so we might be familiar with this, or perhaps, for example, a newborn infant, if you were to stick your finger in between their phalanges, they have this sort of innate, meaning coming genetically from within, not learned. So it's a very simple type of reflex, which is could be categorized as a behavior, but it's a grasp reflex where the hand of the baby just sort of grabs around it, and it's kind of interesting. And that's formed before birth. And there's other examples I was talking about, like the withdrawal from pain, for example. You move your hand away from a hot stove. I like these baby reflexes though, which sort of emphasize the innateness of the reflex. So the rooting reflex, very important. Those of you in the audience who have breastfed before can understand the magnitude of importance with this. So it's very important that you sort of rub the upper part of the lip or the side of the cheek of an infant before it is able to latch on during breastfeeding, and that's known as the rooting reflex. Okay. Developmentally, some of these reflexes can be, and I find this kind of interesting because I mentioned before that it doesn't really involve conscious control, and so this is kind of a gray area, if you will. It's an acquired reflex, and so it's a rapid, automatic, but yet somehow learned motor pattern. Like for example, when there's a car that happens to stop short on the road, just the quickness in which you're able to hit the brakes when there's trouble. You can actually develop the ability to become more proficient at that. Another example would be a ski racer that moves incredibly instinctive, if you will, developmentally, but yet acquired quick adjustments in the body as they're moving down the course at such a tremendous speed. And it's learned, but yet also automatic. And repetition, as one might anticipate, enhances that reflex acquired ability. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So I'm going to move on to somatic reflexes and then visceral. So somatic, as the name may imply to some of you out there, involves skeletal muscle. And so this is a motor response. Okay, what we were just sort of discussing, somatic meaning causing the skeletal muscles, which are the effector, to contract in terms of the response. So that's one way in which reflex arcs are categorized. Somatic reflex is an example of one. Under that heading, though, we have something known as the patellar reflex, and this is the famous type of reflex. I think almost everyone would know this one, where your leg kicks up in the doctor's office when you're given a tap on the patellar tendon. But it's technically called a stretch reflex, and so if you don't mind, kick that around a little bit, pun intended. The stimulus is a tap on the patellar tendon, as I was mentioning, and what that does, interestingly, it can get a little complicated, but I'll just sort of simplify it just for our purposes, is that it causes some receptors in the quadricep muscles to stretch. Okay, and what that does is it sends a nerve impulse to the spinal cord, which then results in the kick, the knee jerk response. Okay, and so here's a better diagram describing this. And so here's the stimulus, and so it's a tap on the patellar tendon, which then causes the muscles in the quadriceps to stretch slightly, and that's going to send a nerve impulse to the spinal cord reflex arc, which is then going to come back and cause the effector, which are the skeletal muscles of the quadricep, to contract, and therefore the response is to kick. And so this is quick. The stretch reflex is completed in less than 40 milliseconds, and so the receptors again are these found in the quads, and I'll show you a picture in a second, are referred to as muscle spindles. Okay, and so the tap is right over here in the patellar tendon, and then this can get a little complicated, or we can simplify it. So there's specialized muscle tissue that, when stretched, will then send a nerve impulse to the central nervous system, spinal cord, and then ultimately will cause the muscles to contract and therefore kick. Okay. Another example of this somatic reflex is just simply posture. To maintain normal posture, stretched muscles, if you will, respond by contracting, and this automatically maintains your balance and position in space. Now, these visceral responses are kind of interesting, and I wanted to give you a couple of examples of them. And so this is all part of an autonomic reflex, though, so it's a little bit different. So it's control systems other than the muscular system. So visceral, if you're unfamiliar with this, refers to the internal organs of the body, and so it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. I want to emphasize that. And its internal organs, it could be things as important as your heart contracting, lungs, abdomen, for example, organs in the abdominal cavity, for example, your stomach contracting and intestines contracting. And you're like, really? That's right. Because though those are smooth muscle, the food itself, the muscle functions independently and therefore responds to internal triggers like food and the ingestion of food, or some kind of irritant lining the mucous membranes of the lung. And so in a classic example of this visceral, sometimes referred to as autonomic reflex, is the concept of peristalsis. In other words, the wave-like rolling contractions of our alimentary canal or food canal when a bolus of food moves down, for example, the esophagus, the smooth muscles simply contract in response to the food moving through it. And so that's a visceral reflex, pushing the food through the digestive system so that it can be further digested. And also, simply things like coughing, for example, or sneezing, or something that causes an irritation to the stomach uh, could cause vomiting, for example. So all of these are visceral reflexes. They're unconsciously initiated and can be controlled ever so slightly, though, to a small extent. Should be noted. Uh, for example, if you can try to hold a cough in, for example. Okay, and I want to talk about like complexity of circuits. Sorry, let me go back to that. Polysynaptic and monosynaptic. In other words, the name may apply one synapse or a few synapses. And one synapse is going to occur more quickly, and polysynaptic is a little bit slower, but it involves multiple synapses, from anywhere from two to more than several hundred. Okay, so again, trying to maintain simplicity here. Monosynaptic reflex is where the sensory neuron coming in synapse directly with a motor neuron. And so there's really one synapse coming in and then one synapse exiting as well. Okay, so monosynaptic. Simple, quick. An example of that would be, for example, our patellar reflex. In other words, knee-jerk response is an example of a very quick monosynaptic arc. And polysynaptic arcs or reflexes are important too, because sometimes it involves, at least one interneuron between the sensory neuron and motor neuron, but there's usually multiple segments involved in a polysynaptic reflex. And you can get some more complicated responses this way, and it controls more than one muscle group, and so your reflex can be more coordinated, if you will. So it's useful. Like, for example, the withdrawal reflex is moving the body part away from the stimulus, which is the pain or pressure, for example. But then it's also sort of pulling your hand away, and it's also maybe even dropping, for example, the hot stove. And so it's a combination of multiple groups, biceps, triceps, for example. So this, what seems simple is, that moves the affected part of the body away from the stimulus. But the reflex, a flexor reflex, is an example that involves multiple muscle groups, as I was mentioning. And so, and this response, like the others, occurs while the pain sensation is still ascending toward the brain. So it's very quick still, but yet it's effective. Okay, and then finally the processing site, spinal reflex and cranial reflex. Been mentioning and emphasizing, if you will, process occurs mostly in the spinal cord, but there are exceptions where there is the brain is involved in the processing. So I wanted to point that out. So most of the examples that I've given you are spinal cord, spinal reflexes, but some can reach the brain still quickly. For example, swallowing reflex is an example of a cranial response. And so I want to conclude this discussion of reflexes with this Babinski reflex, and it's a classic one that is performed, Babinski reflex, when a newborn comes into the world, and it's also performed on an adult as well, and it's a example of a somatic reflex, so it's involving muscles, and it's seen in infants, and it's normal. And what happens is, it's sort of like, and I'll show a diagram in a moment, but basically when you're tickling like the lower part of the foot, what's going to happen is the toe's going to flare up like that, and the toes, the big toe is going to flare up, and the other toes are going to go outside. And so this is normal. But if that were to occur in an adult, I want to emphasize this, there could be damage to the central nervous system. And this particular reflex, Babinski, is performed when after an accident, or sometimes it's a fall occurs, for example. And so this Babinski sign positive reflex, in other words, so rubbing underneath the bottom of the is normal in an infant, but it could be pathological in adults. Okay, so this would be not good right in here. Now, if you're an adult, a normal response would be if you it's known as a plantar response, where your toes are flexion. So in other words, the toes kind of curl in, and so this would be abnormal in adults, where the big toe dorsiflexes and the other toes sort of fan out, if you will. And so this Babinski sign indicates damage, as I was saying before, but in an adult, this is negative. A negative response would be healthy. Okay, where the toes are pointed inward, and the response is sort of, if you will, normal, the normal reflex. Okay, so hopefully you found that informative and enjoyable, and thanks for watching.